Hey everyone, welcome to this Explainer. Today, we're unpacking the incredibly complex historical blueprints and the colonial origins of Africa's absolute powerhouse, Nigeria. We're going to look really closely at how a series of, frankly, administrative decisions made over a century ago literally drew the boundaries and built the systems that still resonate deeply today. It's the foundation of the wildly diverse and vibrant nation we know right now.
Okay, so let's dive right in. I want to start with a seriously surprising piece of historical trivia, because it honestly shapes our entire understanding of the country's origins. Now, when you look at a map of Africa today, a lot of the nation's names carry these deep indigenous meanings. But the story of how Nigeria actually got its name, well, it's a completely different story. Believe it or not, the name of this vast nation wasn't born from some ancient, deep-rooted heritage. It was actually just invented by a journalist who literally just needed a shorter word for a newspaper article. I'm not kidding. In 1897, a British journalist named Flora Shaw was writing a piece for the Times of London, and she found the official titles, things like Royal Niger Company Territories or Niger Area, just way too clunky. So she simply suggested combining Niger with the suffix "ia," which means land of. Boom! Nigeria, a short, catchy identifier born out of total convenience.
So here's our roadmap for this explainer. We'll start with who named Nigeria, then look at the pre-colonial civilizations, the 1914 amalgamation, the legacy of division, modern socio-political conflicts, and finally, forging a modern identity. First up, who named Nigeria? The imposition of a name. Now, just think about this dynamic for a second. Lord Lugard, the British colonial administrator who basically drew up the country's borders, was acting as the architect for a house that was named by his future wife nearly 2 decades earlier. Yeah, funnily enough, Flora Shaw actually went on to marry Lord Lugard. It really highlights how the very identity of the state was slapped onto it by colonial figures long before the actual diverse people living there were ever united under any single government.
Moving on to part 2. Pre-colonial civilizations and the land before the name.
You know, the area we now call Nigeria was absolutely not a blank slate, not even close. This region was home to over 350 autonomous ethnic groups. To really put that into perspective, imagine taking hundreds of totally distinct sovereign countries and just forcing them onto a single map. We're talking about incredibly diverse societies here. Each had its own deeply cherished identity, totally distinct cultures, complex trade networks, and vastly different political systems that had literally taken centuries to evolve.
And these civilizations operated in completely different worlds. Up in the north, you had the Hausa Fulani society. After the Jihad of Uthman Dan Fodio, they had this highly centralized system, governed by emirs enforcing Islamic Sharia law and paying tribute to the Sultan of Sokoto. But then you look at the southeast at the Igbo societies, and it's the exact opposite. Highly decentralized, republican, egalitarian. They were led by councils of village elders and Ozor title holders making decisions together as a community. So the idea of suddenly merging these entirely different ways of life into one unified state, yeah, that was always destined to be incredibly complex.
Which brings us to part 3, the 1914 amalgamation, basically a marriage of convenience. Now, this creeping British influence certainly didn't happen overnight. It was a slow burn, starting with Lagos being annexed back in 1861. By 1900, the British had officially set up separate Northern and Southern Protectorates. But the real game-changer hit in 1914. That was the Amalgamation, legally binding the North and the South together into one colony and protectorate of Nigeria. And here's the absolutely crucial takeaway. This massive merger happened without consulting the indigenous residents at all. Nobody asked them if they actually wanted to live together as one giant nation. And let's be totally clear here. The historical records show this merger was strictly about economic and administrative convenience for the British. It wasn't some grand, genuine nation-building project. The British government was, well, let's just say they were incredibly frugal. They wanted their colonies to pay for themselves. At the time, the Southern Protectorate was actually generating a budget surplus, but the Northern Protectorate was financially unviable on its own. So, amalgamation, it was just a neat little accounting trick allowing the British to use Southern funds to cover Northern administrative costs.
Let's look at part 4, a legacy of division, and the real fallout of those colonial borders.
You see, the British explicitly fostered uneven development between the two regions. Up north, their policy of indirect rule meant relying heavily on the existing emirs. And to keep the status quo, the British actively shielded the North from Western education and Christian missionaries. But down south, it was a totally different story. The South was heavily exposed to those Western influences, which sparked rapid educational and economic shifts. So what happens?
You get this massive socioeconomic disparity. And that practically guaranteed we'd see intense ethnic competition for resources and power the second self-government was on the table. And academic sources reveal something pretty startling about the actual mindset of the colonizers during all of this. Research shows that even the top British administrators, right from 1922 to 1948, knew perfectly well the amalgamation was never actually meant to truly unite the country. They actively maintained the separateness of the North. I mean, they went as far as setting up segregated quarters, called sabongari, specifically for Southerners who migrated north. True federalism and real integration, they were literally not on the colonial agenda. Because of all this, the sheer frustration of early independence leaders was just palpable. Chief Obafemi Awolowo, a massive political figure of the time, hit the nail on the head in 1947 when he said Nigeria wasn't a nation, but a mere geographical expression. He was pointing out the glaring lack of a unified national identity caused by these policies. People had been forced into an administrative box, but the cultural and political bridges you actually need to form a true nation, those were intentionally left unbuilt. Now for Part 5, Modern Sociopolitical Conflicts. The Echoes of 1914. It's no surprise that scholars trace the rise of diverse modern militias and secessionist movements straight back to that flawed fusion of 1914. Well, that and the subsequent failure of the central government to fairly distribute resources. Whether we're talking about the tragic rise of terrorism in the north, the intense resource control struggles by militias in the Niger Delta, or the revived secessionist movements in the southeast, historians link all these deeply rooted issues back to that initial failure to respect true federalism and address the heavy legacy of the amalgamation. Think about it. When resources are scarce and distributed unequally, the artificial borders forced on people a century ago suddenly become the exact fault lines where tension erupts today. The ongoing insurgency, the calls for secession, the intercommunal clashes, these are all well-documented symptoms of an inherited, unequal colonial framework, mixed, of course, with modern political mismanagement. Structural inequality and marginalization are quite literally the fuel keeping these conflicts burning. Finally, Part 6, Forging a Modern Identity and Reclaiming the Name. Despite all that heavy history, there is an incredibly empowering resolution here. Just prior to independence in 1960, citizens began stepping up and crafting their own authentic national symbols. Take the flag, for example. In 1959, a 23-year-old student named Michael Taiwo Akinkunmi actually submitted the winning design. He chose green vertical bands to represent the nation's lush agriculture and a white band in the middle for peace and unity. It was a vision for the future, designed by a Nigerian for Nigerians. So, while the architect and the name of the state might have been British, the vibrant, globally recognized identity of modern Nigeria, that has been entirely forged by the daily choices, the resilience, and the sheer cultural output of its citizens. This is a nation that now boasts over 371 distinct ethnic groups contributing to one massive culture. Through the explosive global dominance of Afrobeat music and the massive cinematic output of Nollywood, Nigerians have taken a colonial label and just filled it with their own undeniable power. They share a resilience that completely transcends the arbitrary lines drawn back in 1914. As we wrap up this explainer, I want to leave you with a final thought to ponder. Flora Shaw and Lord Lugard might have created the geographical expression of Nigeria for their own administrative convenience, but it's the people who are turning it into a living, breathing nation. So, how will the next generation continue to evolve this inherited framework into a truly united, equitable, and thriving future? Thank you so much for joining me to explore the deep roots and the incredibly dynamic future of Nigeria.